Hi, I'm Gogo, and welcome to part 2 of this controversial deep dive into springs and suspension and travel and attraction and all of this great stuff that you can use to improve your experience on your motorcycle today and tomorrow. It'll make you safer, it'll make you more comfortable, it'll make you faster, all these things. Okay? This is part 2. Put your thinking cap on. This is going to be intense. Okay, we've got springs, travel, suspension, shock travel, fork travel. Don't violate the window of movement. Now we have to find the right spring for you. How do you find the right spring? Well, there is a pretty simple equation. Not simple to me, okay? But it's like force equals compression and the weight and all this crap. But even if you used this calculation, which I'm not going to get into because I hate math, even if you used this perfect calculation of how much you weigh, how much your bike weighs, that 2-to-1 ratio, how much compresses, you can come up with a number, an appropriate number, a rate of spring that will get you into the middle of your travel. You can do it mathematically, but it's going to be wrong. Why is it going to be wrong? And this is one of those things that makes suspension black, right? Oh, it doesn't understand it. Doesn't have to be black. There's just more considerations than just this mathematical equation to get you in the middle of your stroke, of your travel, right? There's more things to consider. If you took one guy who weighed 150 pounds, okay, and you used this mathematical calculation to get just the right spring for Charlie, okay? Charlie is going to go ride his bike, and Charlie only goes to the restaurant that he works at and back. So 60 miles an hour, okay. So with whatever spring we calculated that is right for Charlie, his travel maybe is going to be this much, right? He's using 20% of his travel. He's still hitting bumps, right? But his suspension is too stiff really to absorb those bumps. So Charlie, by the time he gets to work, wants to kill himself. Doesn't like his motorcycle, sells it, and now he drives a Volkswagen Beetle. That's no good. That's no good at all. So in Charlie's case, he's riding slow. He doesn't want whatever spring, like here. Maybe that equation gave Charlie a spring like this. And maybe Charlie would be better off with a spring like this, okay? So what's the difference? If you put this spring on, now he's going to use more of his travel, right? It's the same Charlie. He's 150 pounds, and he's using more of his travel. Same bike, same guy, a lighter spring. Now let's say Charlie goes to the California Super Bike School, and now he's the man. And now he's going to a track day with his appropriate spring. Now he's hitting bumps at 150 miles an hour. Guess what? Now he had his suspension dialed a minute ago. And now, bam, bam, he's bottoming out, he's topping out, he's blowing right through the stroke of his shock and his forks, and he's a mess. He probably crashed already 3 times. Why did I crash? I thought I was a good rider. Same guy, same motorcycle, spring's too light. So this is why this equation that you can use, force equals blah, 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 it's not the only tool that you need to come up with what spring rate is right for you and your motorcycle. You gotta sprinkle a little bit of an experience on there. And it's not that hard because it's not like, well, if he's going 60 miles an hour, he should use a 9.5 spring. And if he's going 150 miles an hour, he should use, like a 150 or a 200. It's not that different. Maybe he needs a 95 Newton meter spring when he's going 60 miles an hour to the restaurant. And maybe after the California Superbike School and he's going to a track day, maybe his 9.5 is going to be like a 100 or a max 105. Okay? So that's how you go down this little bit of a journey and you figure out this is the right spring rate for me, my weight, for my motorcycle's weight, and for my riding conditions, how and where I'm going to be riding the bike. The 3 variables, okay? Now look, the room's not so dark. It's starting to get a little bit of light. That's not that hard, right? Now, Charlie knows the spring rate that he wants. Let's say he figured it out. He knows the kind of riding he's doing. He knows his weight, he knows his motorcycle. So this is going to be his spring. So here's where we dive into a very challenging part of this video. I'm a little bit nervous about this because learning for me was very challenging. Being in school every day in every class felt like I was drowning because I don't learn like the average person learns. And this feels a lot like teaching, and it's remembering bad times. And I don't want you to have a bad time, okay? So hang with me. I'm going to try my best to make this complicated thing simplified. Preload. This is that mysterious, misleading, counterintuitive, scientific element of taking the spring that is appropriate for you and setting it up inside your shock, outside your shock, so it's appropriate for the shock. Now, how do we know how to set this spring into this shock? How do we know how much preload to put in it? Why do we need preload? What is this preload thing all about? Well, I think what can help clarify this is we think about this in, like I just was saying, 100 pounds, right? You put 100 pounds on it and it compresses an inch. But it's not really that way. Think about in 1 pound at a time. Imagine if this tape measure, which is great, by the way, Milwaukee, metric, good for your suspension. Let's say this weighs 1 pound. And I take this tape measure and I put it on the spring. That spring just compressed a little bit. It might take the Hubble telescope to measure exactly how much, but it did compress, theoretically, 1 pound. So Charlie's spring, if you put it in this shock and you put it on the bike and you take the bike off the stand, immediately this spring is going to start to absorb that 200 pounds of the motorcycle. And it's going to compress and it's going to compress and it's going to compress. And we didn't even get Charlie on the bike yet. So for the life of this motorcycle on the road, it's always going to have at least 200 pounds on it. It's never going to have less than 200 pounds on it, right? And that's without the rider. Now Charlie gets on it and it's always going to have 300 pounds on it. Oh, it's compressed even more, right? In the compression that you got, absorbing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 50, 100, 300 pounds, all these added together, in all of that distance that the spring traveled, we used up a lot of this 50 millimeters of stroke in our shock. We only have 2 inches. And we just used a lot of that travel just holding up the weight that's always going to be there. The motorcycle's always going to weigh 200 pounds. Charlie's always going to weigh 100 pounds till his girlfriend gets on it. And then it's going to be even more. So we preload the spring, meaning as an act of assembling the shock and the spring together, we put some pressure on it. We have to compress the spring and put it on here with a spring compressor, and it already has, here's the key, how much? How much preload should it have? This is also black art, oh my God, suspension. It's not that black. It's not even gray, to tell you the truth. If you think about it logically and simplify it, it's not that complicated at all. So we already know when you consider our window of travel, right, that we want the motorcycle and Charlie suspended somewhere in the middle. We don't really want it in the middle, because this is another step of confusion. There's more compression force from bumps that you hit that are non-negotiable. The sharp bump that you hit at 150 miles an hour, that thing's got some energy in it. You may not see it, but you'll feel it when you hit it. And that needs to be absorbed. So when you follow the movement of the shock as it absorbs impressions from the ground, when it hits that bump, ooh, it's going to go down and come very close to bottoming. Remember, we have the right spring for Charlie and his riding and valving and stuff. I'm not really talking that much about valving. It's another subject for another day. But let's just think about the spring. So boom, we come down, the chart goes down close to bottoming, but it doesn't bottom because we got the right spring, and then it comes back. Now, when it comes back, it's gonna pass the middle, right? Because there's a lot of energy on rebound too. That it's gonna come past the middle and before it returns. So it'll be going along with this, bam, we hit the bump, we come down, we come up, then we're back level again. So we were smooth, impact, rebound, and now we're level. That's how it's gonna work. But if you look at the chart, let's say the table is the bottomed out, and here's topped out. Boom, when we hit this bottom, we come close here, and when we come back, we don't really come that close to the top. The rebound is not as strong as the compression, as the smash. So you don't really put your window of travel, you don't put it in the middle. You put it a little bit higher up so you can absorb more compression and you don't need as much room on the top for a rebound. So how do you get there? How do you figure that out? Well, that's when people talk about measuring sag, measuring static sag, measuring rider sag. So static sag is just the motorcycle. Off the kickstand, off the rear stand, and just boom, it's floating on the spring. Where does it measure? What it measures is, so you put the weight of the bike on it and it's gonna compress this a little bit, right? It's gonna compress the spring. If we had no preload on this spring, if we had zero preload, it's gonna compress this a lot, right? So we want preload. We wanna put 100 pounds on it, put 200 pounds on it, well, this is where it gets, critical. And there's no one answer for this either. You put enough preload, so in the end, Charlie, when he's sitting on his motorcycle, here's the top of the window, here's the bottom of the window, here's the middle, Charlie's around here, okay? So if he's got 100 millimeters of travel, which we talked about originally, the shock travels 50 millimeters. It's a 2-to-1 ratio. So from the axle up to the seat somewhere, vertically up, he's got 100 millimeters of travel available, right? So he sits on the bike. Maybe he wants to be 35 millimeters, 30 millimeters. We can experiment with this, but it's not 50. He doesn't want to be in the middle because more impact, more compression than rebound. So a lot of people talk about measuring static sag and then measuring rider sag, and this is what the two numbers should be. This is sign language for bullshit, because that's also another element of this misleading stuff. And I'll tell you why. What if we were setting this bike up for Charlie's girlfriend and she weighs 95 pounds? How do you get Charlie's girlfriend to be at 35 millimeters of sag, which we already determined? Let's say, here's 50 millimeters of sag measured at the seat. Here's 100 millimeters of sag, and here's 35. Let's say we're gonna set her bike up with her little spring, because she's a light chick, to have 35 millimeters of sag. Once we get her 35 millimeters, how much, and she gets off the bike, how much static sag do you think there's gonna be? A lot. Because if you divide how much weight she equals, if she only weighs 95 pounds, how much is actually on the seat? 60? So if you want to get that motorcycle to that 35 millimeters of sag, you're going to have a lot of static sag. Just the motorcycle alone is going to probably be at like 25 millimeters of static sag. And then she jumps on it, goes 10 more. because she weighs nothing, right? Let's say you've got a rider who's 400 pounds, and I have known some 400-pound motorcycle racers who were fast as shit. They're out there, and more power to you. So now, our 400-pound rider gets on the bike, and we want him to have 35 millimeters of sag. That's our number, right? That's what we're going for. How are you going to get that? If the motorcycle weighs 200 pounds, and then our rider, if he's 400-pound rider, 300 pounds is going to be on the seat, and 100 pounds is going to be on his hands on the bars, right? So 300 pounds. Now you have a motorcycle that weighs 200 pounds and a rider that's going to add 300 pounds to that. So you're going to have so much preload on this spring that you're going to have no static sag. When you have this thing with a proper amount of preload to give Max, let's call him Max, to give him 35 millimeters sag, when you take Max's bike off the stand, it's not gonna budge. It's not gonna budge. It's not gonna move. This shock is gonna be tapped out, full length, no static sag. You will have put in preloaded this spring here to have, well, let's see, 200 pounds for the bike, 300 pounds for the rider. So maybe you're going to use 100 pounds of his 300 that's going on the seat to get to that 35 millimeters, right? So we're going to preload Max's spring with 400 pounds of force. We're going to preload it so that when he gets on, that extra 100 is going to sag the bike to 35 millimeters. So that's why static sag 10 millimeters, it's not appropriate for everybody, right? So that's why I'm like, oh, I don't understand. I follow these rules, and he said that, and she said that, and my bike doesn't work that great. You gotta get over the bullshit, right? This is sign language. Get over the bullshit. And this is how we're doing it together. Okay, I find sometimes if you exaggerate a situation, it helps you understand it better. So we got a little bit of like, maybe we're 100% in sync here, maybe not. So this might help to get us on the same page. What would happen if Max got on Charlie's girlfriend's bike? He would sit on that bike and compress the suspension to bottom down before he even went 1 foot forward, right? He would have no suspension, okay? What would happen if Charlie's girlfriend got on Max's bike? With 400 pounds of preload in that spring, the bike weighs 200 and she weighs 60 in the seat, so 260. Well, the shock already has 400 pounds, the spring already has 400 pounds of preload into it, and she's 200 for the bike, 60 for her, she's not moving it. There's 140 pounds of pressure that still has to be applied to that seat or to the tire until she has suspension. So Max has no suspension on Charlie's girlfriend's bike. Charlie's girlfriend has no suspension on his bike, right? She's gonna bounce in the air, and he's gonna bounce in the air too, because remember the bump is not negotiable. That energy is there. If Max hits that bump at 50 miles an hour with no suspension, that bump, you're going. He's going for a ride. I don't care how much you weigh. He's going airborne, right? And if Charlie's girlfriend hits the same bump at the same speed, she's going in the air because her spring says, I'm not absorbing that. It's not, I have way too much energy in me already. I have way too much weight preloaded into my spring. So this is why when you buy a motorcycle from a dealership, from a manufacturer that is set up, this is why I say it's set up a little bit for everybody and not at all for anyone. Because you can't make a motorcycle for Max and Charlie's girlfriend and Charlie. But they do all the time. So everyone is a little bit compromised, right? The lighter people have a too heavy spring, the heavy people have a too light spring, and we do our best to work with what we have. But if you just spent a little bit of time and you got the appropriate spring for you, you would have a completely different experience on the same motorcycle that you already own. So now you understand why we need preload and why we need different amounts of preload for different people and different riding conditions. And holy hell, did I do it? Did we do it? Do we understand each other? Okay, so we understand springs and rates and the idea of suspension and travel window and stroke and all these great things. And we even know spring rate, right? And we have the right rate for Charlie to get his sag, and Max and Charlie's girlfriend, who weighs 95 pounds. So we understand all those things and they all make sense. The dark black room is getting a little bit of light in the corner. Well, it's about to get a little bit lighter. There's this myth that we're going to debunk right now. There's this misunderstanding that is really, it's a conundrum, all right? It's counterintuitive. A lot of people mix this up. Even some suspension professionals, which I've talked to like 1 week ago. And these are good guys that know what they're doing. And they don't really understand it 100%. It's because it doesn't really make sense. And I'm going to try to explain it right now. And it's kind of twisted. So stick with me. But you will get this, I promise. I will not stop this video until this point is made. We understand that in order to compress this spring, it's going to take force, a certain number of force. If this is a 100-pound spring, it's going to take 100 pounds to make it compress 1 inch. We understand that. And we understand preload and why we have to put preload on this spring to support the motorcycle in the right place so that Charlie's at his 35 millimeters of sag, and therefore he will hit his bumps and he will use the major part of his travel, 80%, leave a little bit on top, leave a little on the bottom. We understand all that stuff. So we install Charlie's spring with a certain amount of preload, so that will give him a certain amount of sag. Perfect. What happens if we give it a little more preload? What happens if Charlie's riding his bike and maybe he wants a little more preload, but he doesn't really understand what that means? Like me at Bridgehampton, when I took preload out, I thought I was making the spring softer. And I bet you that's what Charlie thinks. And that's what one of my suspension pros last week thought too. You're making the spring softer. That's not what's happening. That's why I crashed. That's why I took out Richie Alexander. That's why I never met Michael Jordan. Okay, so let's go back some 25 years to my crash at Bridgehampton. Why did I lose the front? We already established that I lost the front because I bottomed the forks. But why did I bottom the forks? I actually had a sound idea. Backing off the compression, backing off the rebound, making the bike softer, more compliant. I'm going to hit the bumps, slower speeds, reins, less traction. So it was all a sound idea. Even backing off the spring was a good idea. Where I dropped the ball, where I made the mistake, was thinking that backing off preload would make the spring softer. This is the controversy, and we're going to solve it right now. Okay, so let's go back to our trusty 100-pound spring. We already know it's 100 pounds per inch spring, and let's say Tigger weighs 350 pounds. This spring is going to compress 3.5 inches. Let's say on the motorcycle, I weigh Well, the motorcycle is 200 pounds in the back, 200 pounds in the front. And if I'm 200 pounds, most of me is on the seat, so I'm 150. So 200 plus 150 is 350, right? So I'm just as much force as Tigger is. So we install this spring with 300 pounds of force put into it on here, and we put it on the bike. What's going to happen when I sit on the bike? Nothing. It's not going to move. This shock with 300, squeezing this spring, 350 pounds worth of force, is extended all the way, right? It's as long as it can be. Put it on the motorcycle, it's still as long as it can be. I jump on, it's still as long as I can be. But if I take this 5-pound thing and put it on the seat with me, now the bike goes down a little bit, right? Because 355 pounds. So if you think about it here and you had 350 pounds of preloaded force on this spring, and I took this preloader adjuster and I turned it out, that would be 349 pounds. If I turned it again, 348 pounds. So the spring would get theoretically softer the more I backed the preload off. But that's here. And that's like in this theoretical conversation where there's a table or a concrete floor and that's a constant and the weight is a constant. It's not that way on the motorcycle, and here is why. Sag. Sag is the whole screwball here. If I want 35 millimeters of sag, I don't want to install this spring with 350 pounds of force on it. Maybe I'll install the spring with 250 pounds of force on it, okay? So now this is on the motorcycle and I sit on it. Now it's 100 more pounds than it was preloaded to take. So now the shock gets a little bit shorter. The spring is suspending me. The spring is suspending me in air, my extra 100 pounds that it wasn't prepared to take. So it's smushed a little bit, 100 pounds worth, it's smushed. But it's really, really helpful to think of it like when it got shorter, when it smushed, it got shorter this way. Just, it's not really only the bottom, but let's just think of it that way because it helps. Now, remember when I had the spring in here and I had 350 pounds of preload and I went one turn, 351, 352, right? I can't add any more weight. I can't add any more force to this because I no longer have a floor, a solid floor, concrete floor, this table. I don't. The bike is floating and it only has preloaded, what do we say? 250 pounds, right? So, and I weigh 350 pounds. There's another 100 pounds worth of cushion here. There's 100 pounds existing here, right? So if I was to take the preloader adjuster and back it off, the bike gets lower, right? But the spring doesn't change at all. If this spring measured 300 millimeters when it had me sitting on it, right? 300 millimeters, so I back off a millimeter, I back off a millimeter, I back off a millimeter. The bike gets lower, but the spring doesn't get any shorter. I am not affecting the spring rate, the force that's on it at all. And that's the mistake I made at Bridgehampton. So I backed off. Or, you can also raise your ride height with preload. You put it in more. But again, you're not making the spring shorter. You're not affecting the 350 pounds of force, the 250 pounds, nothing. You're not changing anything. And if you don't believe me, take a tape measure, go into your garage, measure your ride height, sit on your bike, measure that height, and then go to your spring and wind some preload into your spring. And then measure your ride height and see what happens. Measure how long your spring is, see what happens. You will find too that while the spring is suspended, remember, with that extra 100 pounds of me, we had it set up with the right sag, so that extra 100 pounds exists right here. So you give it more preload, and you give it more preload, and you give it more preload, until, you see what's getting longer is the shock. The body of the shock is getting longer, but the spring isn't, because if the shock was, let's say the shock is 1,000 millimeters long, when I sat on it and that extra 100 pounds that gives us the 35 millimeters of sag compressed this shock. Now it was 865 millimeters long, right? It's shorter. So as you put more preload in, the shock gets longer and longer and longer until it gets to its, let's say it was 1,000 millimeters long, until it gets to that topped out length. Now when you give it more preload, the spring starts getting smaller. You are actually increasing the force that's on the spring, but not when you're still in this cush window, not when the shock is still not at its fullest extension. Same is true for when you're backing it off, 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 right? So you go up and down like this. So why did that cause me to crash though? Like, why didn't it just affect my ride height? Like if I didn't make the spring softer, what did I do? This is what I did, and this is why I crashed. Because we've already talked about, you have a window of travel. If this is the topped out, and this is the bottomed out, we want our curve to go like this, right? So when you play with preload, you're taking your whole curve, the whole body of your curve, and moving it up or moving it down. And I said, I'm gonna make my spring softer because it's raining. So I undid my preload, backed off, and my whole beautiful window that was working perfectly in the dry at 160 miles an hour went down, down, down. And now when I hit bumps, I went, and then I bottomed out. Nothing was near the top here, but I bottomed. So I hit the brakes, and I got low in my stroke, and then I hit that bump. Boom, bottomed out. And that bottom out, smushed the tire, I crashed, end of story. So there is your argument. There is the beauty and the science and the controversy, all debunked, okay? Preload, as long as you're in the sag window, does not affect the length of the spring, which also equals the force that's in the spring. It does nothing to it until you're maxed out at the top length or crushed at the bottom. I get asked a lot of questions online about setup. Where should I have my forks, and how high should I have my rear, and lots of questions like this. Because racers are always playing with that, always lifting the rear, lowering the front, going up, down, always playing, because these things really have a massive effect on the feel of the bike, how quick it turns in and how it accelerates out of its turns. Like, this is massive as far as what you can do and what you feel and how fast you can go. So I get a lot of questions, and one of the questions that I get, because I'm like a Super Duke, I love Super Dukes, is people ask questions that have the Evo, the Super Duke 1290 Evo. And the Evo has electronic suspension adjustments, and how it adjusts the ride height is with preload to the spring. And my first answer is, like, I don't like the idea of adjusting your ride height with your spring. And we already know why, because that's how I crashed at Bridgehampton, okay? If you were ideally set up with your shock and with your force and you're riding the Evo around, you're using most of your travel in this beautiful window and you're happy as a clam. Let's say you want to raise your rear ride height a little bit, or let's say a racer wants to raise his rear ride height a little bit, just to test, see what it's like. So he's gonna put some preload in, right? And that's gonna lift the rear of the bike, or lift the front of the bike, and maybe you go around a little bit, you're like, oh, I think I like the way that feels. I think the bike, handles quicker. This is great. The downside of that is you just moved your window, right? So maybe you're going to be topping out now in your beautiful curve that you had perfectly dialed. Now you just moved your curve up to the height, or you moved it down. Let's say you're maybe not that tall, right? So damn, I really love the Evo, but it's too tall for me. So you back off the preload. You bring it down. Now you're going to be bottoming like me. So typically what a racer will do, somebody who understands what's happening, is they're riding around and, oh man, I want to try a little more ride height in the back. I'm going to just see how this feels. So they'll give it a couple of turns of preload, which does nothing to the spring, but it moves, it raises the ride height. It makes the shock a little bit longer, which raises the height, right? Do a few laps and say, whoa, I like that. I like the way the bike feels. First thing they're going to do is go to the shock, take those turns right back out, because they already know what their window is. They know where their travel is, and it's good there, right? But they want that 3 millimeters more. So they'll take the shock out, undo this clevis, and turn this ride height adjuster 3 more millimeters. Put it back in, tighten everything up, and now the spring, the travel of the spring and the window of your travel, it's all what it was before, but you've got 3 more millimeters of ride height. So that's why racers will do that, right? They want to play with the ride height, but they don't want to violate that window. And unfortunately, the Evos, or other motorcycles that have the ability to, adjust ride height with the spring, it's more of a way to like experiment, so to see if you like that feel. But it's way better, way wiser and safer to get to that place on a permanent state mechanically with the length of the shock. And in fact, I started an e-commerce business where I make and sell links for the Super Duke. And this is why I sell them, because most Super Dukes, like the OEM shock, here's the OEM shock right here for a Super Duke. Look at the bottom. There's no ride height adjustment like on this performance shock for the same bike. There's no ride height adjustment. So unfortunately, a street rider has no way of adjusting his height. And I've discovered that the Super Duke really likes to have ride height. He likes to have more ride height. So no street guys can have any ride height. So I make links that will mechanically give you the ride height without affecting your spring, without affecting your travel, your spring. None of that has to change. All I can stay right where it is. So there's the answer to your question of why you can experiment a little bit with preload to give you ride height, but you don't want to live there. You're like, oh, I like the way it feels. Fix it mechanically and get there mechanically. Leave your spring in its happy place. Leave your travel window in its happy place. Understand? Do you really understand? Because I don't. I'm all fucked up. No, I do get this. And I hope that this video, I hope the time that I've spent tonight and yesterday and last week trying to present this all in a way that makes sense, I hope that we kind of let some light into the room. Because suspension is not a black art. A little gray, but that's just because you didn't really focus on it that much. If you think about it, if you really listen, maybe play this video again, it's not that mysterious, is it? It's really not. So I hope that you can use these tools and these lessons. I feel uncomfortable saying lessons because it sounds like I taught you something, and I don't have the authority to teach anybody anything. I'm like mixed up and confused half the time myself. But I did finally come to understand this, and the first thing I want to do is share with you, because we're all better off the more we know, right? We all get more out of our motorcycles, we all get more out of our Super Dukes. Whatever your bike of choice is, God help us, we now understand springs. Knowledge is power.